Back in 2017, Jordan Peele's Get Out showed audiences how horror films could be used to explore racism.
Good to see another brother around here.
Yes, of course it is.
Despite its critical acclaim, Get Out wasn't the first nor the last horror film to deal with race. From 1968's Night of the Living Dead. To this year's horror comedy, The Blackening.
You are a Black character in a horror movie. Prove that you can stay alive. Name one Black character that survived a horror movie. You must answer correctly, or you die.
Many films have used horror tropes to expose racial divides in the United States. This is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Today we're looking at race and representation in horror books and movies. We'll see examples of positive representation, and we'll also see examples of harmful stereotypes. We'll hear from a horror fantasy author whose writing is informed by his work as an academic historian. And a professor of Indigenous Nation Studies talks about some of the Native creators who are breaking stereotypes with their work. But first, Mark H. Harris is an entertainment journalist and co-author of The Black Guy Dies First, Black Horror Cinema from Fodder to Oscar. The book came out earlier this year and explores the history of Black horror movies and how representation has changed through different eras of film. And just a note to our listeners, some of this conversation may not be appropriate for small children. Mark, welcome to Disrupted.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start with a confession. I am very afraid of horror films. I blame it on the childhood trauma of being told that Michael Myers lived under my bunk bed and never really getting over that. And I still find myself going to see them even if my hand is over my face. The title of your book, however, refers to a very common trope within this genre, and that is that Black characters are often killed off very early in the film. Talk to us about how that trope became such a prominent feature of the genre, or at least a prominent perception of the genre.
The violence elements in horror movies started to creep up in the 1960s. And at the same time, Black roles, which used to be kind of more comedic sidekick sort of roles, those kind of roles became a little passe, and they kind of were more, because they were more of the demeaning sort of Mantan Moreland types of roles where, you know, Hollywood had kind of outgrown them, and the ACP had kind of pushed those kind of roles out the door. And so Hollywood really didn't know what to do with Black characters at that point. So kind of those two elements kind of combined in the 1970s or so, where, you know, there was a demand for people to kill in horror movies and a need for Black roles in horror movies. And so kind of these Black characters were they were never the heroes or the main characters in these movies. So in horror movies, if you're not the hero, you're kind of the fodder.
So we started talking about my sort of love-hate relationship with the genre, but you are someone who really is into the genre. Not only have you written about it, but it's really had an imprint and an impact on how you think about these issues beyond movies and beyond cinema. And one of the things that you talk about is this influential horror film, which has now in some ways become a classic, Night of the Living Dead. What was it about that film that really drew you into the genre? And what was so memorable about the first time you saw it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was the movie that really drew me into horror. I remember borrowing a VHS copy from the library in the 1980s I was 11 or 12 years old, and I'm sure my parents didn't know what I was getting. So I appreciate their ambivalence, but I just kind of popped it into the VCR, and I didn't really know what to expect, but it really just struck me as this ancient black and white movie. And yet it had this Black character who was the lead, who was taking charge of this group of white people who was slapping white people around and stuff and ordering them around. And it struck me that, even in the 1980s, if this movie had come out then, it still would have been revolutionary in its portrayal of this Black character, because even in the 1980s, you really didn't have these roles where these movies where the Black character was the lead and was the main hero. So that really just struck me that happened in such a, to me, what was an ancient movie, although at the time it was less than 20 years old.
What I think is fascinating is that then we move into the 1970s where you get this blaxploitation genre. And so then we see not just the action blaxploitation films, but also horror sort of getting this mix in with blaxploitation as well. What was that genre like, given the themes that you've talked about before of how Black characters are portrayed and in many ways meet their demise early?
Yeah, the blaxploitation era is really an exciting era. I mean, it received its share of complaints and criticism at the time too. There was even a campaign to cancel quote unquote blaxploitation at the time. But I think it was, we have to judge all the films and roles by their eras and what was really available to people at the time. So I think the blaxploitation era was really an exciting era because even though a lot of the movies were made by Hollywood and white filmmakers, a lot of them were also did have Black creators behind the scenes. Like Blackula especially was kind of the preeminent Black horror movie during that time, and it had a Black director, William Crane, and the star William Marshall had a lot of input on the roles, the role in the movie. It was really, I think horror in that era really kind of was a precursor to today's kind of social commentary horror, because you had Blackula had a lot of social commentary. A lot of the villains in that were the police. There was a movie called Welcome Home, Brother Charles, which was kind of a lesser known movie, but it was the lead character was a Black man who was framed and put in jail, and he kind of developed this ability, so to speak, in jail, where he could actually grow his penis into several feet long, and he used it to strangle his enemies when he got out, strangle all the people who put him in jail, the corrupt cops, the corrupt judge, the lawyers, that sort of thing. So it's an interesting entry in the genre there. But after that, in the 80s, Hollywood kind of thought, oh, we've had blaxploitation, we've had the Black stories out there, we've had enough, and we can move on to something else. So, it kind of comes in cycles. So thankfully right now we're kind of in an upcycle where Black stories have regained popularity, but you never really know with these things how Hollywood wants to treat them.
So Mark, you mentioned that we're sort of in an upswing when it comes to Black art in this genre. I went to see Get Out multiple times because I needed 3 times to watch it in its entirety without covering my face. And every time I saw it, there was something else that I noticed. And I think it really fits into that broader theme of how this genre is used as sort of social commentary. It's used as a blend of humor, but also addressing some of the difficult realities that Black folks face. What do you think of this moment now, or what do you make of this moment within the genre of Black horror, given the historical trends of it, but also where we are in terms of cinema and the horror genre more broadly?
Yeah, I think we're in like a high point right now. Frankly, I think we're kind of in the Black horror renaissance, thanks largely to Jordan Peele and his movies. But I think horror in general has always kind of reflected society. It kind of reflects the fears and anxieties of society. So you can go back to things like, the Godzilla movies reflecting fears about nuclear proliferation, or, in the 70s, you had like the Stepford Wives reflecting worries about women's roles. You had movies like Dawn of the Dead and the stuff talking about commercialization, that sort of thing. So I think horror movies have always kind of reflected America's fears and anxieties. And so I think now, in the last 10 years or so, we've kind of gone through probably the greatest social upheaval in our country since the 60s, where we've had a rash of different social movements. We had the Black Lives Matter movements, the Me Too movement. To a lot of people, it's new. To us, it's not very new in terms of the messaging. We've been saying kind of the same thing for years, but I think America has been at least a little more open to kind of hearing it. And the fact that Get Out was not only a critical hit, but a commercial hit really struck with Hollywood, because they're like, oh, you can make money off of this too.
And I'm thinking about progress and representation generally, but particularly when it comes to art. And so we can see people like Jordan Peele being able to make these advances, people being more open or interested in them in terms of film and cinema, understanding that they make money and generate revenue like other films. And then I think of a show like Lovecraft Country, which to me was canceled prematurely and had really attracted an audience that people didn't think of and imagine, but was able to do this really good art, really creative, imaginative writing, and wasn't able to continue. And I think of that, Mark, because even as we can increase the films and increase the shows and who's in front of the camera, really addressing who's behind the scenes seems to be an area where Hollywood continues to lag behind, particularly in this genre, but more broadly of how we see Black writers, producers, and directors. What's the change that we could make, or at least to point out that as we talk about the genre, the future of the genre, we also need to think about the writers, producers, directors, and other people behind the scenes?
With the Blaxploitation era, and even again in the 90s, there were these movements of Black movies, and, the predominantly white Hollywood was like, okay, we'll give them a shot. And they kind of wrung them dry. And when the receipts started to flag a little bit, they said, oh, enough with that. We'll move on to something else. And so I think the way to prevent Black stories from becoming just a fad is to have, people behind the scenes who are willing to fight for these stories and to find interesting ways to twist the stories and to make them new. To get all the different sides of Blackness represented. And so, I think we just have to really kind of keep pressure on the studios to kind of keep these things, these stories alive, stuff like the hashtag Oscars So White movement a few years ago, kind of, that really has helped. I mean, there's been a lot more Oscar nominations for Black people since then.
So I'm going to try to overcome my fear, Mark, because I've read your book. I feel encouraged. If I regret it, I'm going to reach out and let you know. But one of the horror films that came out this year, it's really a horror comedy, is the film The Blackening. So talk to me. Should I see this film? And if I do, what did it mean for you to have this come out the same time as your book?
I think it's definitely a safe movie for you to go watch. It's a comedy first and foremost, so it's not terribly scary, and it kind of plays into a lot of the Black horror tropes and stereotypes. I think the tagline in the movie is something like "We can't all die first" or something like that. So it's a really a good example of how more open Hollywood is to these stories. I can't imagine this kind of movie being made 10 years ago or so. And there's been actually several movies this year alone with Black leads. Like there was another one called Talk to Me that's from Australia, but it had a Black female lead. There's another movie called Cobweb. There was a Dracula movie, The Last Voyage of the Demeter, that came out that you couldn't tell by the previews, but it actually has a Black male lead in it. So even though it takes place in the 1800s or whatever, I think Hollywood is finding ways to squeeze these Black characters into these roles where they wouldn't normally have been considered in previous years.
Mark H. Harris is an entertainment journalist and co-author of the book, The Black Guy Dies First, Black Horror Cinema from Fodder to Oscar. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Coming up, Author P. Jolly Clark talks about using horror to examine real-world issues, and later, Professor Kaylee Simmons explains how some stereotypes about Native people in horror films date back hundreds of years. This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Today we're looking at how horror in film and literature can parallel the horrors of racism in American history. Our next guest is P. Jolly Clark. He's an award-winning fantasy and horror author based in Connecticut. His works include Ring Shout and next year's The Dead Cat Tail Assassins. His short story Hide and Seek was recently included in the collection Out There Screaming. It's co-edited by Jordan Peele and John Joseph Adams. Jolly, welcome to Disrupted.
Thank you for having me here.
You have accomplished quite a bit in your writing, in your storytelling, and you have recently accomplished something that makes you super cool to my teenager. And I don't know how much you're around teenagers, but that is quite a feat. And so that is having your short story, Hide and Seek, included in this collection. Talk to us about how that came to be.
I have 5-year-olds, so we'll see if I remain cool when they reach that age. I had written several horror stories, a novella by the name of Ring Shout, a short story, Night Doctors, and a few others. And I was contacted and asked if I had anything to contribute to an anthology. And I'm often busy in writing in my academic life. And I said, well, I don't know. And they said, well, you should know it's an anthology edited by Jordan Peele. I said, well, I'll make time. And so I came up with a story, I submitted it, and I was fortunate enough to get selected to be part of this anthology, which includes a lot of great writers that I admire as well.
One of the things that I think is so powerful, not just about Hide and Seek, but about your work broadly, and particularly in this short story, is that you deal with real world issues that are so familiar and are so proximate to a lot of people, but you deal with it through the lens of horror and fantasy. What is it about that genre that allows you to tell these really complex stories that resonate with people and actually can create a whole new experience and view for your readers?
Yeah. I think one, people like being scared. So there's the entertainment aspect of it. But, there's a scholar of horror, Kenitra Brooks, who talks about how horror is often our ways of dealing with trauma. And there's a way that trauma can be hard for us to express, hard for us to deal with personally, hard for us to communicate with others. And there's a way that horror can, fill in that space. It can become a medium through which you can discuss trauma. And so, for some of my stories, the horror and the trauma is talking about racism, aspects of white supremacy, like in Ring Shout, in Hide and Seek. Part of the trauma is about addiction. And so, there's a way that I think some of these conversations can be very heavy if we try to just have them one-on-one. And there's a way in using horror and using metaphor, right, and illusions and allegory. There's a way that I think you can connect with people, as any storyteller does, by using that type of genre.
There's a particular art to that kind of storytelling because you keep readers guessing, trying to figure out what is the horror in the story. But then by the end, you realize there is no singular horror, just as there's no singular experience of trauma, that it's this constant battle and negotiation, whether it's an internal battle or some external force. What is the arc in all of your work, but particular in this, that you say, I want people to be able to confront this? Your work becomes a mirror in some ways, but you're also pushing people past what they would expect to really engage the work. How do you do that as a writer?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. They would love this in workshops if I could come up with these perfect answers. I think part of it when it comes to horror, I think people may mistake that horror is just, for instance, slashing type films, or horror is just the jump scare scene where the person jumps out, or it is the cat and it frightens you in the movie. or it's just reading something that just immediately gives you shivers and goosebumps. And that is horror too, right? Those are all parts of horror. Horror is a large genre. So I'm not saying that's not horror. There are a lot of people who love those films for those reasons. But the horror I'm often interested in is the horror times, sometimes of the unspoken, the unseen. The horror, as you said, that when I write the stories, I try not to give away what the horror is right away. My stories are always part mystery, where you may think the horror is one thing, but as you go further on, as you said, you realize, oh, it's this other greater horror, it's this threat that I didn't think of before. And so I try to get that across in my stories, because I think that's more frightening, that where you're not certain what the true thing is, or where if you've settled into thinking, okay, this is what the horror is, and when it happens, you're like, oh, I wasn't prepared for that. I enjoy that type of storytelling, right? And so something like Jordan Peele, for instance, I think that's what I love about his works. You do not walk into a Jordan Peele movie knowing immediately what the actual horror is. It takes you a while to figure it out, even while horrific things are going on. And when it finally hits you, you're blinked and you're stunned, right? That, okay, this is what the horror was. And you start putting the pieces together. And yeah, I think I enjoy that type of horror from writers, from films. And, I seek to recreate that in my own work.
I will have to confess to you, and my production team laughs at me about this. Horror as a genre terrifies me, not the kind of violence, slashing, because I can say, oh, that's, silly. It's the things that get into your mind and your experience and make you come back to it. So whether it's a Jordan Peele movie or it's your stories, that I have to go back and reread pieces of it, like, wait a minute, did I just read that? Because it'll stick with me in a way that I come back to it again. And that's the terrifying part, because now I'm drawn into this thing that is rankling me in some way. There's a power in that. But you're also an academic historian, which also has a lot of power to challenge us to rethink what we thought we always knew, to draw out nuance and subtlety that most conversation generally doesn't allow for. How do you see those two spaces of being an academic historian and being a writer in this genre, and the powerful ways that, again, you make people keep coming back and questioning what they think they already know?
Yeah. I mean, I have a t-shirt that said history should make you uncomfortable, which is perfect for this age that we're living in, where it seems some people don't want to be discomforted by history. And history can be uncomfortable. History can have its horrors. And there's a way that, it makes almost sound pat or cliche, but there's a way that as much of the horrors that we dream up tend to pale in comparisons to the horrors that human beings have experienced and committed against each other. And so there's a way in pulling on those. As you said, sometimes I'm trying to illuminate what I think are, if not silences, things that are underreported, underappreciated by society. And I'm trying to expose, sometimes when I use history, I'm trying to shine a light on those bits of history through a bit of darkness, through horror, right? In order to have people understand the magnitude of what this meant. In my story, Ring Shot, for instance, I'm talking about the birth of the second Ku Klux Klan, the film Birth of a Nation, and what that meant for people who were living through this time, who had to deal with literally these horrors in real life. And I will say that history will never leave me without ideas when it comes to speaking about horror.
Why the decision, or what was sort of the thinking behind, yes, we're talking about literal monsters, but we are also talking about the Klan and how that connection created a perpetual horror for Black folks and others across the U.S.?
Actually, I was doing some academic work looking at the WPA ex-slave narratives, which are basically the interviews of the last generation of enslaved people in the United States, taken around, the 1920s, 1930s. And as I was going through those interviews, people are talking about what it was like living at the end of slavery, with the coming of emancipation and end of the Civil War. And they're also being asked often about the birth of the Ku Klux Klan, the first Klan, which, is created the very year the Civil War ends. And what struck me was them talking about this first Klan as monsters. calling them haints, like ghosts, saying that the first clan didn't dress in hoods, they dressed in flour sacks, or they would wear horns or pretend they had tails, or have chains they would shake, or sometimes they blackened their faces, they used blackface, and how they would try to pretend that they could drink large amounts of water. And there was this way that these former slaves are talking about their trauma by imagining the clan as monsters. I say imagining them because they well understood who the clan was. They were like, I know who that is. That's Judge so-and-so. I worked for him. I was enslaved by him. I know that he's a person who puts on this hood. But I thought it was fascinating that to talk about the trauma and the violence and the repression that they went under, they talked of the clan as monsters. And there were these ways to stop them by, they couldn't cross water, or you could put down vines that they couldn't cross. And it just, like you said, it stuck with me, right? It just stayed with me for years. This idea of racial terror as actual terror, right? As actual monsters. And that's how the seeds of Ring Shout came about, right? It was me wanting to give voice to these former slaves who were talking about their trauma, and in a ways where I thought it was underappreciated or unknown. I wanted to bring that to light. And I could have written an article about it as a historian, but I chose instead, I want to use it. I want to tell it through a story, right? And I think of the African-American literature writer, Pauline Hopkins, from the early 1900s, right? She often believed that one of the best ways to get ideas across was through the story. Right? She said the story sometimes can impart more wisdom than simply telling something to someone. And so, yeah, that's how that came about.
There's a piece in Ring Shout that has stuck with me, of the many pieces of it. And one of the characters says, it's hard to tell who won the war and who lost. Yes. And I kept thinking about you as historian and as storyteller, how those two things converge, especially given where we are in the U.S. right now. Talk to me about that question. It's hard to tell who won and who lost.
Yeah, I mean, this was something that if you go back and look at the end of the Civil War, and you see these African Americans who are now freedmen, and they're watching as former Confederate officials who had once torn down the American flag, committed the ultimate treason, gone to war against the United States, that, Andrew Johnson is allowing them to just slip back into power. And they're just coming back into power, and they're passing black codes and all these laws. And they literally are writing letters to the government and said, like, wait a minute, we were the ones who helped you win this war. We were your scouts. We were your pilots. We were the soldiers, right? We stayed loyal to the Union, while these people who you're rewarding were the ultimate traitors, and you're allowing them to come back into power. You're allowing them to just do as they wish to us. And they asked this question, who won the war, right? Was it the Union who won the war, or was it these Confederates who seem to have gotten no punishment for what they've done, for this ultimate treason they've committed? And this is a theme that you would see African Americans ask over and over again as they watched a little apartheid system under Jim Crow come into being, as they watched this lost cause take hold of the United States, which was so exemplified in things like Birth of a Nation, the first great film that is the most salient lost cause narrative. They watched monuments to Confederates go up, and they would constantly ask this question, wait a minute, who won the war, right? And it was something that I wanted to bring in there from their perspective, that we can still ask today, as we still are dealing with these histories, or we're still dealing with the suppression of certain histories. And we still sometimes have to ask, who won the war at the end of the day when it came to the Civil War?
We're headed into 2024. You've got a new book coming out, The Dead Cat Tail Assassins. Talk to us about this book that I am anxious to read and also already terrified to read. Talk to us about this new work.
So I will say, you might be happy to hear this or not, but the Dead Cattail Assassins is not a horror story. So what I always say, as much as I like horror, I like a lot of different genres. I have a middle grade book that's out that is much more fantasy. I'm not trying to scare the children, though there are some scary parts in it. I will say it's called The Benny Song. I'm finishing up book 2 now of that middle grade. And so I write across different genres. And this one I decided to return. I decided that, much as in Ring Shout, like as much as the horror, I also have a scene with a juke joint because I want to show that even as people are dealing with this horror, they also are living their lives and loving and arguing and everything else with each other as human beings, right? And so much in the same way, as much as I write about issues of trauma, I also sometimes want to write different stories. And so this is a secondary fantasy story. It is, people have called it John Wick meets Dungeons and Dragons.
Okay, I can do that. That's totally, you got me.
So yeah, so it's almost, there are some dark parts in there, but it's almost a bit of an escapist for, hey, I think we may need to escape a bit in this coming election cycle. So before we get ready to do the hard work, or if we need a break for the hard work, you can read an interesting story about an undead assassin by the name of Aveen. And as the going goes, and as the saying goes, as she always says, the dead cat tail assassins are not cats, nor do they have tails, but they are most assuredly dead.
I think you just voiced the perfect trailer for your book and for your release. Like I'm all in now. As we come to this close of our conversation, I want to ask you this really direct question. What inspires you to write?
What inspires me? People reading. People reading my works. My mother was a fabulous storyteller, right? My parents come from a Caribbean island, Trinidad and Tobago, and one of the things they always say about Trinidadians is they talk, talk, talk. And my mother was a fabulous storyteller. And I take a lot of my storytelling directives from her and the way she tells stories. And there's something about the joy of telling stories, about, I would be the person, I wish I could sit over everyone's shoulder as they're reading my stories and be like, did you like that part? How about this part? Oh, I can't wait for you to see this. And so, it's just the joy of the knowing that other people are going to read my things and they might find interest in it. That's what keeps me going.
Well, we know you'll keep going because we definitely will keep reading your work. P. Djeli Clark is the award-winning author of the short story Hide and Seek. It's included in the collection Out There Screaming, co-edited by Jordan Peele and John Joseph Adams. His new book, The Dead Cat Tail Assassins, will be released in 2024. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Coming up, Professor of Indigenous Nation Studies Kaylee Simmons explains how horror can get people to question the boxes that they are often put into. This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're looking at race and identity in horror books and movies. Kaylee Simmons is Assistant Professor of Indigenous Nation Studies at Portland State University. Her scholarship looks at works that depict Native people and ones created by Native people. I asked Professor Simmons what drew her to the horror genre.
Yeah, I've always been a fan of horror since I was young. I probably started reading horror too young. And, was let loose at the library and dug through all the Stephen King. And for me, I think as someone who doesn't occupy a kind of, mainstream body, I found affinity in these stories about these other beings that also didn't sort of fit into the kind of categories that immediately made sense. And I think the best of any horror story, whoever's writing it, will get you to challenge those categories, to say we think the world is set in stone and that everyone can fit in X or Y box, but actually there are these other beings. And I think what Native stories do really well is to say, instead of destroying those beings, how can we build ethical relationships to make the world more livable for all kinds of beings, regardless of, where they fit in.
You mentioned Stephen King, and I was smiling because I, as someone who is really afraid of horror, read every single Stephen King book probably younger than I should have been, but I was just still fascinated and afraid at the same time. Stephen King is sort of the, really the pioneer in this field. How did Stephen King in his novels and his films, how did he depict Native peoples within his work?
I mean, not to call out Stephen King totally, because I think the literary traditions that he engages in terms of Indigenous tropes, predate him by hundreds and hundreds of years. So if we think about something like Pet Sematary, right, that he is sort of playing off of this trope of the, Native American burial ground. And it's fascinating to me that Native Americans in particular, our burial grounds are extra scary, supernatural. And there's a few harmful ideas encoded in it, right? There's the idea that Indigenous cultures are so natural as to be like supernatural. So our relationship to the land is this kind of otherworldly relationship rather than one grounded just in like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years of observation, right? And that particular idea ties into a longer history of Indigenous representation that is really tied into this idea that Indigenous peoples are incapable of change, that we're, so connected to nature, that we're unable to, deal with modernity, deal with technology, that we're kind of permanently trapped in the past. And there was a lot of racial science in the 1800s, right, that literally thought that Indigenous peoples were kind of frozen in this like pre-evolutionary state. And so therefore we could be studied as these objects of prehistory. So when Stephen King is sort of propping up this trope again, which I think in that particular text is a direct response to the Maine Land Claims Act, which was a piece of, restitution legal action that was coming through prior, in the late 1970s, where land was being restored to tribes in Maine. There's this fear of colonialism has enacted all of these horrible things on Indigenous peoples. As soon as Indigenous peoples get any power back, they're going to use it to take revenge on us. And I can see that narrative unfolding in a lot of different places now. And that's a narrative that, again, predates contemporary discussions, predates Stephen King, as far back as the 1600s. In the earliest captivity narratives, these narratives allegedly told by folks that had been taken captive by Indigenous peoples. We now know some of them were totally fictionalized. Some of them were questionably editorialized. That in these narratives, they often start with the Indigenous raid on the settler fort or the settler encampment. And what they don't say is all of the other colonial violence that preceded that, right? And so if we come back to Stephen King, right, we start with this native burial ground filled with vengeful spirits that seem to be enraged for some nondescript reason, but we don't actually set up the history of dispossession that would perhaps lead people to be disgruntled. It really renders Indigenous resistance to colonialism in this really unnuanced, simplistic way. So Stephen King did a bad, but I think the more you look at the longer history of Indigenous representation in a variety of genres that eventually feed into the horror genre, there's just this tendency to sort of go back to these same kinds of tropes and narrative constructions. And it's about how do we break this cycle?
I want to talk about a film that's not a horror film, but is definitely getting a lot of attention in this same vein. And that's called Killers of the Flower Moon. It's generating a lot of critical attention. I'm wondering, given what you just said about those tropes and representations, what your views are on that film within this vein of representation, authenticity, and who's telling the story.
I mean, it's incredibly important that the story is being told, and I'm glad that folks are wanting to do a deeper dive into the history of Indigenous dispossession. And I think the original novel that the film is based on will do that. And from what I've been hearing from both Indigenous and non-Indigenous critics who've been able to screen the film so far, they think the film does a good job of doing that. I appreciate Martin Scorsese. He's made some great movies. And he's done the work of consulting with tribes. I think the Osage people have come and said, he did a really good job consulting with us. He changed aspects of the story significantly in order to make this, a more holistic story. But in the back of my mind, I just can't let go of the idea of what if instead of directing this, Martin Scorsese gave funds to a young Osage person and training and skills and mentorship so that they could tell the story. And Martin Scorsese has a history of telling particular stories of his community from a particular perspective. And I suspect it is because he's invested in the good ethics of storytelling that he feels he can, as an insider to, being an Italian American in New York, that he can tell these kinds of stories from a perspective because he knows that community inside and out. And I wish that were also the case in Killers of the Flower Moon, that I really think it would have been a meaningful act for him to let the Osage fully and truly tell the story 100% from their perspective. And given that we've had this massive sort of shift, I think, in Indigenous representation in the mainstream with works like Rutherford Falls, with works like Reservation Dogs that now have both ended, we're really looking at this sort of gap in Indigenous representation. And I really wish that the film industry as a whole, because so many additional resources are required to make a film than, say, a book, that they would really start committing to giving Indigenous peoples full control of their stories. There was a period in the early silent period in the 1920s and 30s where there were Indigenous peoples directing, starring, and making their own films. A lot of people don't know that. And that once that sort of, lost momentum, we've kind of been in this limbo state of having some opportunities, but not a really sort of structured commitment from the film industry.
I'm curious if there's a particular Indigenous creator within this horror genre that you say, you know what, they're getting it right, or their work is interesting. This is something that we should be talking about more. Is there anyone that comes to mind within that horror space?
We can't have this conversation without talking about Stephen Graham Jones, who's been doing work within the genre for decades, who's incredibly prolific, whose storytelling ethos I find incredibly ethical. I also think he just loves horror more than anyone I can think of, and is so committed to deeply understanding the mechanics of horror, the tropes, and then turning those things inside out to say, here are all the ways that these erase or forget Indigenous peoples, and how did I have to sort of read this horror in these really sideways ways in order to see myself in it. He's starting to do the work of, putting Indigenous peoples at the center of these narratives and making us not have to do that work. I think his book, The Only Good Indians, is amazing. It came out when I was, in my, just turning 30. And I was like, this is the first time I've seen myself reflected in literature in this kind of complex way. And I think in terms of newer folks that are producing Indigenous horror that I find really compelling and interesting, Ramona Emerson has a brand new book. She's a Dene Navajo writer, and her book Shudder is all about it's like a take on the crime novel with a supernatural spin, where the protagonist can communicate with ghosts and spirits. And it's a very interesting inversion of the kind of Indigenous ghost trope. But it is really grounded in community, because she is thinking about how the main character is kind of exiled from her community, or is seen as an outsider because she has this capacity to communicate with other kinds of beings. I think another person that is incredibly popular up north, but that perhaps is still gaining some traction here in the US is Cherie Dimaline, who is a Métis writer who has tackled not only horror, but science fiction. Especially her second novel, Empire of Wild, is all about a woman whose husband goes missing, and we discover that May have been transformed into this being called a Rougarou, which is sort of like a Métis werewolf. And just the compassion and intensity that she writes into her characters, her mastery of craft is so amazing. And then I think I would be remiss not to mention Never Whistle at Night, which is a new edited collection co-edited by Shane Hawk, who's an amazing Cheyenne writer, and his work is great. Never Whistle at Night compiles a lot of really big name Indigenous horror writers that from the US, from Canada, and I'm really excited that it's coming out and that folks can get their hands on it. It's edited by Shane, and then also Theodore Van Als, who I work with at Portland State.
Let me ask you this one last question. Is there a dream story that you want to tell within this genre of Indigenous horror stories?
I mean, there are so many good stories. I'm thinking about like traditional Lakota stories, and I've heard that we have a story about, it's kind of like a warning story for kids to, not stay out too late, that there are these kinds of like shadow entities, like every person has a shadow version of themselves that normally lives underground that can kind of like sneak around. And so I've heard stories of like, grandparents saying like, you need to come inside to make sure that like the right version of a person was coming inside. That I find, resonating with like the work of Jordan Peele in such a profound way that I was like, wow, we have our own sort of scary doppelganger stories. Yeah, and those are the kinds of stories I want, is like stories that come from a particular community, from a long tradition of storytelling. I want some good Bigfoot stories. I want some good, stories about complicated relationships to all of these other beings that I know come from communities, but that I might not even heard about yet. I think that's just the most exciting thing that I get to do, is to hear communities get excited about, like, we have stories like this too, and let me tell you about them. Because I think there hasn't been space before for folks to do this kind of work of sharing around horror specifically. And I really look forward to seeing what people have to share.
I look forward to seeing what people have to share. I look forward to reading the scholarship that you're going to create in this area. And as you were talking, I was thinking that would be a beautiful edited volume of how different communities tell these stories, because what you just shared is familiar in some parts of Appalachia and West Virginia. It's popular in some communities across the South as well. And so the work that you're doing is bringing us together into this common understanding. Kaylee Simmons is Assistant Professor of Indigenous Nations Studies at Portland State University. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Wayne Edwards, Meg Dalton, and Katie Tularski. Our interns are Lateshia Peters and Joey Morgan. You can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcast. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.